Making Rainbow Waves, a podcast by ILGA World. Welcome to Making Rainbow Waves, the podcast by ILGA World, where we tell the stories of LGBTI human rights defenders worldwide. This episode is dedicated to the International Day of Action for Trans Depathologisation, marked on 21st October. My name is Daidos Gudmundskas, and in today's episode, I will be speaking with not one, not two, but four wonderful guests. Dr. Anna Coates, who's the lead technical advisor and unit head for gender at the World Health Organization. Anil Padavatan, who's the head program officer at Global Action for Trans Equality. And Sophia Fontaine from Trans Iceland, and Joey Jolene Matali from Tonga Ladies Association. Welcome, everyone.
Hi, welcome.
So I want us to begin by contextualizing this conversation. Anil, could you share with us a little bit about what we actually mean when we say words trans pathologization and trans psychopathologization?
So thanks, Darius. The idea of pathologization, it's a long word, but what it really means is the idea that someone, just by existing, so just by being trans, we are somehow intrinsically disordered. And that can refer to the idea that we might have some sort of physical illness or the idea that we have some sort of mental disorder.
Thank you very much. Could you describe the historical developments leading to medicalization and perhaps describe the processes that led to trans depathologization or trans psychopathologization?
So just very briefly, in most pre-colonial societies around the world, there was some recognition of trans and gender diverse identities. But despite this, the pathologization of trans identities was introduced into Western medical systems at a very early stage. And by the 1700s, being trans was considered some sort of physical disease in Western medical writings. By the 1800s, trans and gender diverse people were also increasingly being considered a danger to society. And this view, which was then exported to the rest of the world during colonization. Gender identity and sexual orientation were conflated by the colonial European powers, and laws were then introduced that criminalized trans and gender diverse persons in a number of ways, either based on perceived sexual orientation or based on gender expression, which was often framed in terms of laws that criminalized cross-dressing or impersonation. By the 1900s, there was an interesting development where there was a sexology approach to transgender studies, which developed in Germany, but this was destroyed by the Nazis, and several of the trans and gender diverse community members who were working as staff members at the institute that was developing these studies actually died in Nazi death camps. And in post-war Europe and the USA, there was an increasing social awareness of trans and gender diverse persons, and medical studies started. But these developed a psychopathologizing approach where trans identities were actually framed as some sort of mental disorder. As modern gender-affirming healthcare developed, so did the role of gatekeeping, with doctors seeking to identify what they were terming true transsexuals who were given early forms of gender-affirming healthcare, while other trans and gender diverse persons who didn't meet their diagnostic criteria were refused treatment. In the 1960s and the 1970s, at the same time that activists were successfully campaigning for homosexuality to be removed as a diagnostic category, the diagnostic categories related to trans and gender diverse persons were being included in the DSM and the ICD under sexual deviations and psychosexual disorders. And in the 1990s, when I was studying psychology, I can remember opening a textbook on psychiatric disorders and finding a page on something called gender identity disorder. This was the first time I'd encountered any information about being trans, and I can still remember the feeling of panic. And I was asking myself, do I have a mental disorder? But fortunately, the trans community has a proud history of activism and actively opposed pathologization throughout the 20th century. This activism gained increasing traction in the 2000s, with the International Day of Trans Depathologization being commemorated from 2009 onwards. In 2018, after extensive engagement by trans and gender diverse state organizations, the World Health Organization removed transsexualism and gender identity disorder for children from the mental and behavioral disorders chapters of the ICD. And so in the ICD-11, we now have gender incongruence included in the chapter on sexual health, not as pathologization, but in order to facilitate access to gender-affirming care. And this has been a great step forward. But unfortunately, around the world, pathologization continues. Governments continue to put in place and enforce laws and policies that require a medical diagnosis before allowing trans and gender diverse persons to access gender-affirming healthcare or legal gender recognition. And religious groups continue to use pathologization as a rationale to push the use of so-called conversion therapies, despite the scientific evidence that these are harmful. And so we are still continuing in our struggle against pathologization.
Thank you so much, Anil, I think, for providing this very great insight. And I really appreciate how you sort of highlighted the impacts as well that I think sometimes are kind of forgotten on how pathologization might actually impact trans and gender diverse communities who live their day-to-day lives and experience their identities on a daily basis. Like you sort of prompted, it has been now around 5 years since the World Health Organization recognized that being transgender is no longer a mental illness in the International Classification of Diseases 11th edition. Anna, could you explain the significance of this decision and its potential implications for trans and gender diverse individuals worldwide?
Yeah, thank you. I'd be happy to, Darius. And perhaps not surprisingly, given the long history that we've just heard, I would like to begin by sharing that removing trans identities from the ICD chapter on mental health was a long process. In fact, it was an 18 years long process. So it really does mark a momentous step forward with profound implications for trans individuals worldwide. The most important thing is that this change, as we just heard, marks a shift away from pathologizing gender diversity as a mental disorder. And that's really important for both practical as well as more social and political reasons of inclusion, of gender equality, and of human rights. In terms of inclusion, of course, we hope that by no longer classifying transgender identities as a mental illness, it goes a long way to setting at least the basis for normalization. It promotes the understanding that being transgender is a natural variation of human diversity. So hopefully in the long run, at least, it will help reduce stigma. And we anticipate that in turn can lead to a reduction in discrimination and violence against trans individuals by fostering greater acceptance and understanding, by reducing prejudice and discrimination, and promoting full inclusion in society on the basis of equality. And of course, it upholds human rights principles by recognizing the dignity and autonomy of all individuals to self-identify their gender, to live in a way that's congruent with their gender identity, and to have access to the care needed to make that a reality in whatever way an individual chooses for themselves. And I think that's where the practical dimensions of depathologization come in, because it's a really important move to promote better access to gender-affirming care, but also a more inclusive approach to gender diversity in general healthcare. On this very practical level, the reclassification reduces barriers to all aspects of gender-affirming care, so hormone therapy, gender-affirming surgeries, and many others, which we know can be critical for the well-being of trans individuals. And the removal from the ICD chapter on mental health can also have legal implications that we just heard. It can promote legal gender recognition on official documents like identification cards and passports, which is, of course, really important in many aspects of life, but it's also instrumental to be able to access all aspects of healthcare in the way in which each trans person chooses, and to address the discrimination barriers that many trans people face when accessing care, when their identity documents don't match their gender identity. And there are really many other health impacts of this as well. Legal recognition of gender identity can help remove stigma, which of course is associated with many negative mental health outcomes, depression, anxiety, and very sadly, suicide, as we know. So in all, trans depathologization, it's not the only answer, but it does open many doors to progress towards better health outcomes for trans people, as well as hopefully opportunities for a more dignified life overall.
Thank you so much, Anna, for sharing that. I think it's quite striking how you mentioned, how long that decision to remove trans identities from ICD took. I think you mentioned 18 years. And of course, that decision was also, it kind of happened because of many, many years of advocacy efforts of trans and gender diverse people to make that change happen. And I think on that note, I'd like to speak to Jolene and Andy a little bit about their experiences in their national context. So, Andy and Jolene, in your experiences, how has the deep psychopathologization of trans identities influenced the situation of trans and gender diverse communities in Iceland and Tonga?
Well, thank you. I think realistically, when we started the Pathologisation Association, some of these words, such as pathologization and depathologizing, was never in our language, was never in our vocabulary when we started in 1992. Until later on, as we were going towards the main goals and vision, then we had to experience the actual wording that they were using in the scientific world to actually label us, the trans community. When we first started, that's what we really heard from the Ministry of Health, that being a trans or being a lady is a mental health, and I used to argue with them all the time. And I said, what are you talking about? I'm speaking clearly to you. I don't know what mental health you're talking about, because I ain't walking on my own on the road without, talking to myself. I'm actually talking to you. And if there's an issue that I need to know, then you better we speak my language so we can understand. At the end of the day, we will know what we're both talking about. And especially, we started this association when AIDS hit Tonga in 1987, and we became more labeled with all sorts of words and scientific marginalized words that they used. And we were the target. We were the sinful person. We were the cause of AIDS. And then our names became invisible. We were called AIDS. And these were things that we started with 31 years ago. I don't know how we survived up to today, but we're still alive. But really, the main thing that we did was trying to educate our own people first, our own trans community, because our association was, started by trans people. And, we wanted to educate our own community, especially not just the trans community, but the whole rainbow community, so they can understand and know where we stand, that nobody needs to come and tell you that your mental health, you're this, you're crazy, and because we didn't have the expertise in this line of work, and we've always joked about this, that in the world of health here in Tonga, there's doctors for animals, but there's no doctor for trans issues, right? They always joke about it over here. This is just our own community who joke about it. Of course, some of the medical doctors didn't like it, but that's the reality. Nobody wants to talk about us or our issues, let alone trying to have a proper counseling for someone who wants to take hormones. These are some of the issues that we had to go through since we started, and to make sure that we educate our community. But the first people that we actually educated were the church leaders. And I thank God that they didn't gun us right up at that time. But yeah, things are much better now compared to 30 years ago, that they understand what we're talking about.
Thank you for sharing that, Jolene. I think a lot of things that you say really resonate with me, and what I also see in other countries and other sort of contexts, especially around, educating our own communities and trans communities, and sort of dealing with perhaps internalized sort of ideas of self that are hurtful or sometimes damaging to trans communities or gender diverse peoples, or dealing with internalized transphobia and things like that, and actually learning to kind of grow and understand that our identities are something that, we can take pride in and that we can celebrate. Angie, did you find that there was perhaps any overlap or similarity or differences in Iceland from what you heard from Janine?
Well, yeah, especially when it comes to educating our own community. The pathologization and depath process has been very educational in Iceland, I would say, because when we speak of trans and gender diverse people, when the laws were changed, it was very educational to see who was immediately included and addressed and who was made to wait when it comes to our own legislation. There's the Gender Recognition Act of 2019, which passed, and there were a number of changes that immediately went into effect for what we might call binary trans people. It's because that is very easy to conceptualize for a lot of cisgender people, that somebody transitions from one binary gender identity to another. And so the law addressing their concerns and their needs and their desires was implemented very quickly. Left behind and made to wait in this were non-binary trans people and intersex people. They had to wait their turn because this was a little bit difficult for some cisgender lawmakers to be able to wrap their heads around, like why it was important and what their needs were, what their desires were, and how they can best be addressed. Even though we had made this very clear for years, precisely, like when it comes to intersex issues. Intersex Iceland is a very active group in this country, and they have been lobbying for many, many years to stop performing non-consensual cosmetic surgeries on children, on infants in most cases. And there's a very clear demand, but the bill was passed in July 2019. But even though that particular clause was in the original draft of the bill, that was removed by the government at the time because they wanted to form a committee to examine this and investigate this and all kinds of, legal jargon. Fortunately, that change was put into place, but in December 2020. And also there were some changes made to the law that were more inclusive of non-binary and other gender diverse people in terms of legal documentation, such as passports and what have you, and name changes and gender markers on legal documentation. But for myself, it was very interesting to see, who was made to wait and who was readily addressed. Iceland prides itself on its stance on human rights and gender equality. And so when it came to this issue, it was very, especially in the wake of the changes that were made in the WHO in 2018, it was very easy for a lot of lawmakers to be able to wrap their head around a binary trans person, But it was educational to see who was listening to other people and who had not been, and who felt that non-binary people can wait, intersex children can wait. And yeah, unfortunately, those changes have come to pass. It was just frustrating initially to see that some folks had to wait and who was prioritized and who was not. Another thing that was interesting, though, was that previously Iceland's process this the process I went through myself, was to go through 6 successive interviews with psychiatrists and psychologists to basically give the same answers to the same questions before somebody who was, would get educated about us, but very seldom talked to us, deemed you worthy of receiving hormone treatment or surgery if you wanted it. When this law came to pass and that process was largely done away with, there was still a slow response within the medical system, to where now this bottleneck has formed. Whereas the law said yes and went into effect, the medical system was not properly put up to speed, I could say, so that now there's a very long waiting list for types of gender-affirming surgeries, and even just in beginning hormones. The endocrinology department is swamped at the moment. And so there's a bit of an incongruence between what was happening in Parliament and what was happening in the healthcare system. And that's something that is still being addressed to the point where, when it comes to gender-affirming surgeries anyway, Iceland just decided we're going to just make a deal with a hospital in Sweden because they can't handle, even though we're only talking about like 24 people, I think, something like 24, 30 people. It's still like not something that the, I don't know the inner workings of the national healthcare system, but this is what we have been told anyway, that they cannot handle this tremendous capacity of 24 people. And so they had to make a deal with a hospital in Sweden. And yeah, so that's where things are at right now in Iceland. So it's definitely better than it was, for sure. It's been very eye-opening and very educational to see like what types of gender diversity gatekeepers within Parliament and the medical system are capable of conceptualizing, and therefore who is prioritized, and how the medical system was just basically left holding the bag. Like, we passed this law, now you deal with it.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to that, Darius. It's exactly the same thing that we're going through. But even though we don't have the proper doctors for hormone treatments and counseling and all that, but within the legal side, with so much meetings and negotiating with the government, we were able to change. We were even able to change the law, the rape law, the definition of rape. And at the beginning of this year, in January, it was passed in Parliament. That law refers to anyone, and it's more diverse, and penalty goes to anybody that the problem will apply to. That has been passed. But one thing that we were approached by the speaker was, in order for us to be able to educate more our parliamentarians, our people, was for us to actually translate the SOGI guideline. So you can just imagine the amount of Tongan words that we have for one English word. It was a most pathetic month of translation. I don't know where the heck that we got all those, translation from, because we don't really have a proper scientific word in Tongan for sexual orientation, gender identity, expression, and sexual characteristics. But we had to do it in order for our people to understand who we are and what we are, the different genders and all that. So after it was translated, took it back to Parliament, and the Lord Speaker asked us to work with the Ministry of Internal Affairs and Women's Affairs to actually insert the translated SOGI guideline into the Family Protection Act. And then from there, we can start talking about all the law reform issues that we want to put in. So by then, everybody knows what we're talking about, that we're speaking the same language. And even though it's slow over here, but we're moving forward with starting from the legal side and with the government.
Thank you for sharing that, especially what you mentioned about having to translate SOGI guidelines into a local, national context and a cultural context that might not have the same sort of framework around understanding gender diversity or sexuality. I think this invites a broader conversation around how we can make these practices more inclusive internationally. And on that note, Anna, I want to ask you another question, thinking of this bigger picture. Could you tell us about how can deep psychopathologization impact global health policies and perhaps countries' commitments to the health of trans and gender diverse individuals?
Yeah, perhaps the first thing to note here, as I think we've already heard as well, is that removing trans identities from the mental health chapter of ICD is a significant step forward. But we do also need the right policies as well as advocacy and education to really ensure that shift is fully recognised, fully implemented at all levels to affect equitable and respectful treatment in all aspects of trans people's lives, including with respect to their health. So health policy at both global and national levels is really crucial. And at global level, I think what depathologization allows us to do is to shift from treating trans and gender diverse identities as mental disorders to prioritizing the health and well-being needs of trans people in the same way that we do all other people. Global health policies already emphasize inclusion and equity for all people, irrespective of their sexual orientation, their gender identity, gender expression, or sex characteristics. And they specifically address equal access to quality healthcare without discrimination. In fact, several UN agencies have reiterated the application of these standards specifically to transgender people in recent years, with a joint statement in 2015 calling on states to end discrimination and end stigma against LGBTIQ plus persons in all contexts, including in healthcare. And in 2017, that was reinforced with a joint UN commitment specifically to end discrimination in healthcare settings. And that acknowledged that discrimination has a significant impact on both users of services and health workers. And so ending discrimination is crucial to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, including universal health coverage. And we are, I would say, increasingly focused on accountability for those commitments in global policies. We don't just want them to be nice words that are spoken, but really are something that actually motivates action and results. We have a long way to go, and I would say that the global picture is still quite mixed, to be frank. Disaggregated data, so that meaning data that shows how different groups of people experience health and access to care, are key to accountability. They can help identify healthcare disparities between different groups. They can inform more targeted interventions and track progress towards equity. For many years, WHO has been calling for countries to collect, report, and analyze health data disaggregated by sex. And honestly, that even is a challenge, but we are seeing some progress. The next step will also be to collect data on self-determined gender identity, not just sex assigned at birth. The availability of health data disaggregated by gender identity in most countries across the world is currently woefully inadequate. As we continue towards destigmatizing transgender identity and transgender health, hopefully we can progressively move towards much better availability of that data. Another reason depathologization is important for global health policy is because it opens up the door to providing evidence-based global level guidance to countries to provide both gender-affirming and gender-inclusive care that's aligned with principles of gender equality and human rights. So, for example, I'm very happy to share that WHO is currently working on systematic reviews of evidence to inform the development of the very first WHO guideline on the health of trans and gender diverse people. And I would say that in itself, that the development of that guideline sends a really important message, because it's the work of WHO, which is the global standard-setting public health agency. Any guidelines that WHO produce should hopefully influence national health guidelines and standards. And the priorities that we have identified for this first guideline have been developed, have been established in close collaboration with the trans and gender diverse community. It's going to cover provision of gender-affirming care services in healthcare settings, with a focus particularly on hormonal therapy. And we've heard already from Jolene and Andy how really important that is. But it's also looking at some of the wider aspects of access to gender-inclusive care to meet all health needs for trans and gender diverse people. And that's also fundamental. We know that, some trans and gender diverse people are reluctant to even access emergency care for an accident because of the discrimination they face. So it's going to be focusing on the significance of healthcare provider training to be able to provide knowledgeable and culturally competent care for trans and gender diverse individuals, including for survivors of violence. Again, as we've heard, really important. as well as how gender health policies and human rights aligned provisions of gender identity recognition law can enable the provision of both gender affirming and gender inclusive care. And across all of the priority areas that we're covering, we do recognise the mental health challenges faced by transgender individuals due to discrimination, to stigma, to violence, and as well as the impacts on a wide range of health outcomes. And of course, that's at the global level. Some countries like Vietnam and others like Iceland, we've just heard about, they're already ahead of the curve in a sense in implementing changes motivated by depathologization in the legal frameworks to recognize and protect gender identity in transgender individuals, including in healthcare settings. And that includes allowing legal gender marker changes on identification documents and eliminating, as we've just heard, unnecessary medical or psychological evaluations for access to gender affirming care. So I'd say depathologization is slowly leading to more inclusive, equitable and affirming global and national health policies, which perhaps gives us some room for cautious optimism. But it is also really important to stress that it is a very unequal picture across countries. We do desperately need ongoing advocacy and policy development to harness the full potential of depathologization and to address healthcare disparities and challenges faced by trans and gender diverse communities across all countries. And as you know, unfortunately, we are definitely not quite there yet.
Thank you so much, Anna, for your very valuable insights. You did just speak about the need for more advocacy efforts. So on that note, I'd like to ask my final question and speak to Anil, Jeline, and Andy. And I'd like to hear from you about whether there are any specific lessons or strategies from your country's experiences with depathologization that you think would be valuable for trans and gender diverse activists in other countries to learn from or adopt.
So I think that Jolene and Andy have already spoken about some of the strategies that are tried and tested. And this is around the world. Activists have been involved in building those linkages with the key stakeholders, with ministries of health, with officials, with regulatory bodies, and doing sensitization, doing education, building public awareness, developing guidelines, doing language development, all of these important activities. And we've also seen a lot of countries where trans and gender diverse-led organizations have now been increasingly involved in conducting research, develop the data that we need to go and talk to our various governments and give them the evidence of what we're talking about and why this is important. But I think something new that's emerging around the world and is of great concern is the fact that these are all business as usual strategies for advocacy, but we're not in a business as usual environment. Around the world, we're seeing a very coordinated, well-funded anti-human rights movement. And it's impacting on us as the trans and gender diverse community with the anti-gender disinformation and campaigning that happens in a lot of countries. And it's having a huge impact. So rather than seeing a kind of progressive realization and increasing access to our human rights, we're actually seeing in some contexts a rollback where you are having additional laws criminalizing people being introduced, criminalizing trans and gender diverse identities, criminalizing same-sex relationships, and then also criminalizing the gender-affirming healthcare itself. So we've had some states in the US and some countries in various parts of the world introducing laws that are criminalizing the provision of gender-affirming healthcare. This is very, very worrying. And I think that we really, as a movement, need to start building better linkages with the other movements, human rights movements that are experiencing similar issues, because this is an anti-human rights backlash and they are targeting other communities as well. They're targeting the broader LGBTQI community. They are targeting sexual and reproductive rights. They are targeting women's rights. They are opposed to gender equality and they are opposed to the right to bodily autonomy. And if we are going to make the impact that is needed to counter this, we really need to have the linkages with the organizations around the world and the movements around. If we're going to really have the impact that we need to have in countering this anti-human rights movement, we need to build the linkages with the other movements that are being impacted the women's rights movement, the broader LGBTQI movement, people who are fighting for access to sexual and reproductive healthcare services. And we need to have a coordinated response to addressing the anti-human rights backlash that we're seeing at the moment.
I just wanted to reiterate what Annie was just saying, because I think at a global level, we also, I think this kind of opposition and fragmentation is playing out at national levels, but it's also playing out at global levels. So when we were just talking about what global health policy can do and what we can do with commitments across countries, we are seeing this polarization, and I would call it a polarization because you have certain countries, certain groups which are increasingly progressive, but then you have the backlash and the opposition that Annie was just describing. And in fact, that very existence of the two sides, or the two extremes in a sense, is even in itself is kind of creating some real problems for being able to progress on the global frameworks that I was talking about before. We can't get to what we do always as UN agencies, is WHO is trying to find a consensus between countries so that we can get these commitments signed off in a sense. And we're finding it increasingly difficult at the moment because of these different groups that are involved in the organized nature, as Annie was saying, of the opposition. But it's also a fragmentation, and I would say that's coming as the gender lead for WHO. I think that we need to try and get over this fragmentation of what is women's rights and what is transgender or gender diverse rights. It's part of the same strategy of gender equality and human rights, and we need to be reiterating that message as much as we can, and because we are only doing harm to ourselves in terms of if there's a women's rights movement which is focused increasingly actually on sex rather than gender, in some quarters at least, and then there's a movement which is looking at a broader vision of gender equality. That's not helpful to any of us, and I think we need to try and be as inclusive as possible and emphasize the commonality of discrimination, the commonality of inequalities of power that is really preventing us from progressing. So I wanted to reiterate what Annie was saying now, and the importance of us developing different strategies, called inclusive strategy, but different strategies. There's a whole world out there that's being in a world of misinformation, in a world of digitization, that we're still having the same advocacy strategies that we've often had, and that's not necessarily quite working for us right now.
I absolutely agree with both Anna and Anil, because our work here back in Tonga, and it's the same that goes to all the other Pacific Islands. But I will just concentrate in Tonga. For me personally, in order for us to get things done, we had to work with everybody. We have to work with the Women's Crisis Center. We have to work with the Women and Family Crisis Center. We have to work with all our allies and the people that we know that will back you up in the work that we do.
Yeah. It's a lot of fantastic points were addressed here, like the need for solidarity across intersections. Iceland is a particularly interesting case study because we are in the midst of the beginning of a pretty intense backlash against queer rights at the moment. There, in particular, with regards to trans people. Of course, bigots are very fond of using trans people as the edge of the wedge that splits people apart. And that's as true in Iceland as it is in other countries in the world. So because the backlash is just starting here, we've been, I guess, fortunate in a sense of being able to learn from other countries and learn from the mistakes of other countries. And one of the strongest weapons that bigots have is misinformation, and the fact that it is very, 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 very easy to spread misinformation very quickly and very broadly. But it takes about 10 times more energy to refute that and to correct it. One of the strongest weapons that's being used right now is refuting misinformation. It's really annoying to have to constantly repeat the same truths over and over and over again. It's incredibly exhausting, but that's what the bigots are counting on. The bigots are counting on those of us who are on the front lines getting tired and giving up. And fortunately, as it seems right now, there is no sign of us giving up, repeating these truths. And it has managed to like cross a lot of affinity groups. Like what has been very fortunate is that mainstream feminism in Iceland is very trans inclusive. At the moment, one of the more prominent voices against trans rights has spent the past 10, 15 years also being an anti-feminist. And so the moment this person stepped forward talking against trans rights, it was incredible to see like some of the more prominent feminist voices in the country and women's rights voices in the country just immediately take the side of trans people because of this person, you know? So kudos to them, I guess, for encouraging solidarity. But solidarity is definitely going to be key in this fight. And so is the fact that like you cannot just refute misinformation one time. You can't just do it twice or three times. You're going to have to say it over and over and over again. It's going to be annoying. It's going to be exhausting, but it's the only way forward, I think, towards preserving our freedom.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for sharing that, Andy. I would like to leave us with a positive question. And that question is one thing that you're hopeful about.
The one thing that I am hopeful about is something that Andy was just mentioning, that there can be solidarity as we move forward. And I think the fact that it is actually, we're having this discussion, that there is an ability in different contexts, whilst there are really difficult environments, but we are able to have this conversation. The fact that we're able to have this conversation, I think, gives us real hope that we can move forward in a positive way and combat the discrimination and just have a world where everybody could be whatever they want to be. And there isn't, that discrimination is not up there, but we have to be able to have these conversations to be able to allow that.
I believe that platforms like this and all other platforms opens a lot of discussions about importance of going from the old era to the new today. You know, and in process of colonization and patho and deep going into deep path in Tonga and everywhere else in the Pacific, in some regions, almost all of the colonist populations was forcibly turned away from its traditional belief system. And if I remember correctly, they all forcibly turned away from the Christian faith, which colonizers used as justification for extermination of adherents of other faiths and enslavement of natives and their exploitation of lands and seas, especially in majority of our Pacific islands, and these are things that we need to make sure that we don't separate ourselves from these things. We don't separate ourselves from our culture. We don't separate ourselves from our own families and communities. We need to work. We need to be heard. We need to actually live and be proud of what you are.
So what I'm hopeful about is hearing what Jolene has just said and knowing we have always been here. You know, there have always been trans and gender diverse people. We are part of humanity and we will overcome. We've overcome so much, and we have strong activists who are resilient and tenacious around the world and who will continue to say the truths over and over again. And I'm very hopeful that in the end, we will have a recognition across the world of our rights to equality and to human dignity.
What gives me hope for the future are lessons from the past. We have been through much, much worse than this, and we have survived, and we're going to survive this too, because the only other option is despair. And I've lived too long to despair now, so.
Andy, Anna, Jolene, Anil, thank you so much for what I would call a fruitful conversation about trans depathologization and its impacts on trans and gender diverse communities worldwide. It was such a pleasure to talk to you today, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Darius.
Thanks.
Making Rainbow Waves is a podcast by ILGA World. This episode was hosted by Darius Gervinskas. You can find every episode on all streaming platforms or on ilga.org. Thanks for listening.